Chapter 7. Trailing Clouds of Glory. Imagine an actor named John Smith who plays the part of King Lear. John Smith represents infinite awareness, and King Lear the finite mind, or apparently separate self. Just as John Smith and King Lear are not two different selves, but rather the latter simply an imaginary limitation self-assumed by the former, so infinite awareness and the finite mind are not two different entities. The finite mind is simply an imaginary limitation, self-assumed by infinite awareness for the sake of manifesting objective experience. Imagine that John Smith played his role so effectively one night that he forgot who he really was and believed, as a result, that he actually was King Lear. What would King Lear have to do in order to realize that he was John Smith and thus be relieved of his suffering? In reality, King Lear could not do anything, because there is no real person called King Lear. To suggest that King Lear has to do something to become John Smith would validate King Lear's belief in himself as an independently existing person or entity, and would thus subtly perpetuate the cause of his suffering. However, if King Lear does nothing, he will simply remain King Lear, or at least he will seem to do so from his own imaginary point of view, and, as a result, will continue to suffer. In this case, King Lear will continue to seek relief from his suffering through the acquisition of objects, substances, activities, states of mind and relationships, a never-ending search that will only compound his unhappiness. Therefore, as long as King Lear believes that he is King Lear, there is something for him to do. In fact, it is not possible for King Lear to exist without undertaking some activity to relieve his suffering. If we are suffering, we are by definition already engaged in a relentless search for happiness in objective experience, and therefore doing nothing is not an option. Seeking happiness in objective experience is the activity that defines the apparently separate self. As a compassionate concession to one in such a predicament, the non-dual teaching will suggest some activity or practice whereby the one who suffers will be led, either directly or indirectly, to the source of peace and happiness within herself. If the one who suffers is sufficiently mature, the teaching will guide her attention directly to the source or essence of her own mind, wherein lie the peace and happiness for which she longs. However, if her mind is so accustomed to seeking happiness in objective experience that it is not yet stable or mature enough to turn away from the objects of experience and towards their subjective source, the teaching may give her some intermediary practice aimed at preparing her mind for its eventual return to and dissolution in its own essence. These preparatory practices involve disciplining the body and the mind for the purpose of freeing attention from its fixation on the objects of experience. When attention has been purified, at least to a degree, of its habit of pursuing peace and happiness in objective experience, the mind will only need a small hint as to where to find the peace and happiness for which it longs. A question such as, "Who am I?" or "Am I aware?" will suffice. Whilst all such preliminary practices are legitimate and appropriate solutions to the various inclinations, abilities, and degrees of maturity of spiritual seekers, they must all lead sooner or later to divesting the mind of its limitations. The direct path, by which the mind returns directly to its source, through the recognition of its innate peace, clarity, and luminosity, is the essence and culmination of all spiritual practice, and can be found at the heart of all the great spiritual and religious traditions. Let us return to King Lear, and let us assume that in spite of being deeply involved in the affairs of his kingdom, his mind is sufficiently mature to reflect on its own essence. What does King Lear have to do to recognize he is John Smith? He need only ask himself about the essence of his own mind. Who am I really? What is it that knows or is aware of my experience? Am I aware? Each of these questions will lead King Lear away from the objective content of his experience, the drama with his daughters and courtiers, towards the essence of his own mind, the simple experience of being aware or awareness itself. In other words, each of these questions will draw King Lear closer to the knowledge of himself as John Smith. As King Lear travels back through layers of his own mind, discarding anything that is not essential to it, his thoughts, images, memories, feelings, sensations, and perceptions. The essence of his mind will begin to emerge from its apparent obscurity. At some point, when all superfluous knowledge and experience have been discarded, the knowledge, I am John Smith, is revealed. However, it is not King Lear who recognizes John Smith. Only John Smith has the experience of being John Smith. John Smith is one person, so the knowledge I am John Smith is non-dual knowledge. It does not take place in subject-object relationship. The John Smith that knows is the John Smith that is known. The I that knows is the I that is known. John Smith does not need to do anything or go anywhere in order to know himself. He knows himself simply by being himself. Likewise, only awareness is aware of awareness. The finite mind is not an entity in its own right. It has no existence of its own. It is the activity that awareness assumes in order to know objective knowledge and experience, just as we might say that King Lear is the activity that John Smith assumes in order to manifest the drama of the play. Just as John Smith never ceases being John Smith or becomes King Lear, likewise, at no point does awareness cease being awareness or become a finite mind. And just as it is not King Lear who knows John Smith, so, likewise, it is never a finite mind that becomes or knows infinite awareness. It is for this reason that Baliani said, "No one sees him except himself, no one reaches him except himself, and no one knows him except himself. He knows himself through himself, and he sees himself by means of himself. No one but he sees him." When King Lear and John Smith each say I, they refer to the same essential I, although for King Lear this I is colored, and thus apparently limited by thoughts, feelings, sensations, and perceptions, whereas for John Smith it shines clearly as it is. In reality, the self of King Lear is the true and only self of John Smith. The I of the finite mind, or apparently separate self, is the true and only I of infinite awareness. This is what Meister Eckhart was referring to when he said, "The I with which I see God is the same I with which God sees me." The apparently separate self, or finite, I around whom all experience revolves, is the true and only I of eternal, infinite awareness. The I of God's infinite, self-aware being that shines in each of our minds as the knowledge I am, temporarily colored by thoughts, images, feelings, sensations, and perceptions, but never being or becoming anything other than itself. No self other than eternal, infinite awareness, or God's infinite, self-aware being, has ever come into existence. To believe so is blasphemy. There is only infinite awareness, assuming the activity of the finite mind, thereby veiling itself with its own activity, and appearing to itself as a multiplicity and diversity of objects and selves, but never actually being, becoming or knowing anything other than its own eternal, infinite being. We do not have to eradicate a separate self in order to be knowingly eternal, infinite awareness, or God's infinite, self-aware being. There is no separate self to be eliminated. To attempt to dissolve or annihilate a separate self simply perpetuates its illusory existence. To discipline the separate self is to maintain the separate self. The separate self is an illusion that seems to exist only from its own illusory point of view. However, all illusions have a reality to them. The reality of the apparently separate self or finite mind is infinite awareness. Seeing the reality of infinite awareness is the death or dissolution of the apparently separate self or ego. This is referred to in the Zen tradition as the Great Death. It is represented in the Christian tradition by the crucifixion. Until this point, the separate self or ego has been equated with the finite mind due to the identification of the self with the mind. However, we must now make a distinction between a finite mind that believes in its own separate and independent existence, that is, the separate self or ego, and a mind that has been divested of all such beliefs and feelings, and as a result, shines with the knowing of its own reality. In the case of the latter, the finite mind will continue to arise from its source or essence of pure awareness, but its sense of separation and limitation has been neutralized in the clear light of this self-recognition. Although its ability to mislead us may linger for some time through force of habit, It is only a matter of time before it fades. It is for this reason that when the Indian sage Atmananda Krishna Menon was asked how to know when one is established in one's true nature, he is said to have replied, "When thoughts, feelings, sensations, and perceptions can no longer take you away." To refer to the death or dissolution of the separate self or ego is, at best, a concession to the mind's belief in its own independent existence. More often, it is a misunderstanding. In reality, the mind cannot be said to have disappeared or dissolved, for there was no real, independently existing entity or mind present to begin with, just as King Lear cannot be said to have vanished because he never truly existed as such. King Lear is an illusion. However, like all illusions, there is a reality to him. The reality of King Lear is John Smith. When everything illusory has been removed from King Lear, John Smith stands revealed as he is. In other words, no new knowledge has been added to John Smith. It is only that ignorance has been removed from him. The recognition of our essential self-aware being, its knowing of itself, is the self-knowledge that shines after ignorance has been removed from it. The removal of ignorance and the consequent dawning of true knowledge is referred to in various spiritual traditions as awakening, enlightenment, self-realization, salvation, illumination, liberation, satori, nirvana, moksha, bodhi, or prajna. However, these terms tend to confer a degree of the exotic or the unfamiliar on our direct, intimate knowledge of ourself, whereas in fact nothing could be less extraordinary than the knowing of our own being. For a mind that is accustomed to giving its attention exclusively to objective experience, this non-objective recognition may trigger waves of profound relaxation in the mind or the body, in which the knots and contractions that have accumulated over a lifetime are released. The release of these tensions may precipitate unusual effects in the mind or the body, but such external signs should not be confused, as they often are, with the simple recognition of our own being. Alternatively, this recognition may happen so quietly that the mind may not even notice the transition that has taken place over some time. When the Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki was once asked why he never referred to his enlightenment experience, his wife, who was sitting at the back of the hall, stood up and said, "Because he never had one." The recognition of our true nature is not an exotic experience. Indeed, it is not an experience at all. In this recognition, our essential, irreducible, self-aware being simply loses its apparent limitations, and its reality stands revealed, open, transparent, luminous, indestructible, unborn, and undying. When such a mind rises again from the heart of awareness and ventures out into the realm of objective experience, it does so, as Wordsworth said, trailing clouds of glory. That is, it rises from awareness still saturated with the imperturbable peace and causeless joy that are the essential qualities of awareness, and makes these qualities available to humanity.